Our next guest was censured by her colleagues in the Montana state legislature after she said this about a bill banning gender-affirming care for children.
And the only thing I will say is if you vote yes on this bill and yes on these amendments, I hope the next time there's an invocation, when you bow your heads in prayer, you see the blood on your hands.
Representative Zooey Zephyr was expelled from the Montana State House floor back in April, with Republicans claiming her statement broke rules of decorum.
Last week, a judge denied Zephyr's push to be allowed back onto the floor. Montana Republicans say she's not being silenced as she's able to vote remotely. However, Zephyr says her free speech rights are under attack. Representative Zooey Zephyr joins us now to discuss. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you for having me.
So Zooey, specifically for those who haven't been following the story, what are the decorum rules that your statement is alleged to have broken?
I think that's a question for people who even are following this story, because what we've seen throughout the session is an unequal application of decorum. They are not specifically outlined in our rules, and we've had Republicans in past testimonies who have screamed during their closing. We had Republicans who insinuated that just by my nature of being a trans woman, that I was somehow a threat to children. In one of the hearings, we begged the Republican chair not to allow words like groomer or pedophile. And we were told a lot of people have a lot of opinions. So we have seen the way it's not been used in many instances. And then the moment I stood up to defend my community and speak to the real harm, then decorum was used to stop me from speaking on the House floor.
And what is the state of the legal action that you're taking to regain your right to be inside the State House?
So we took action seeking a temporary restraining order, which is like hey, we need something right now, because we were going into the closing week of the legislative session, seeing major bills, including the state's budget. And in that time, every bill we heard, there were 11,000 constituents who had sent me to be their representative, whose voice was not heard in that debate. That temporary restraining order was denied in what I feel to be a gross miscarriage of justice. And right now we are exploring what are the next steps in that process.
So you weren't precluded from voting, but you were precluded from being literally in the chamber, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And to me, that's an important note. Is you heard Republicans say, well, she still gets to vote. But representatives aren't just sent there to press a button. We are sent there to go with our colleagues and debate the hard topics that our legislature is facing. There was a huge housing crisis in the state of Montana. 50% of my constituents are renters. I fought very hard for landlord-tenant laws. Anytime one of those bills came forward, my community's voice was not heard on those bills.
So Zephyr, I'm curious, I'm struck by watching the statement, and I wonder if you've given any thought to how much of the kind of blowback or the criticism of it is about using what is a pretty common expression, which is, you'll have blood on your hands, and how much of it is kind of combining it with the imagery of prayer. What kind of things have you heard when people go to articulate why it was that they were so offensive? Because I have a hard time imagining that saying, oh, you have blood on your hands, which is something that a phrase that politicians use very routinely, I think, rightly or wrongly, very routinely, would result in this kind of pushback. I mean, what is the culture like? And do you think that the religious iconography there is playing a role?
You're correct to point out that we have seen the phrase blood on your hands. There was a story published about many times that's been used across states and federal levels. I had a Republican colleague from the Senate come and tell me I actually used that same phrase years ago in a House floor debate. So it is a common debate. I think what we're seeing, and it's not just Montana, and I don't know if it's religious iconography, but what we're seeing is that as marginalized communities in different states rise up to speak to the real harm that these bills do, whether that's me in Montana, Representative Maury Turner in Oklahoma, the Tennessee Three, speaking about gun violence in their community and the impacts that the lack of legislation has had on that. When these communities are rising up and holding these far-right legislatures accountable for that harm, we're seeing that it's no longer enough for these legislatures to pass laws. They are trying to silence the people speaking to the very real harm. And that's what I was doing in that moment, not being hyperbolic, speaking to the suicides in my community in the state of Montana.
Yeah, I have a hard time believing that, with the remark you made there is so out of bounds. I mean, that is a common political expression, and it would seem to me like a pretty clear free speech issue. Regardless, obviously the chamber has the right to set its own rules. Those rules could be bad; they could still set them. But have you gotten any support from? You mentioned that a Republican colleague actually told you they can recall hearing that phrase. Have you gotten any support from across the aisle? Not on the your view on the legislation itself, but on the issue having to do with you being able to speak in the chamber?
Now that the legislature has adjourned in Montana as of last week, the Republican colleagues are, have been more cordial, been understanding of, why I said what I said. And I think by and large, their opposition, comes in party line moments, much like the legislation itself. I heard from Republican colleagues, I wish that this legislation targeting the LGBT community wasn't a thing. I wish it wasn't something that I had to vote for. And I would say to them, you don't. You have to look yourself in the mirror every night and ask yourself, did I do what was right? And I know when I stood up to defend my community, I was doing what was just and right and saying this bill gets people in my community killed.
Well,
and if you vote,
where's this then coming from? Because I'm curious what your experience has been like in the legislature and in this community for, I'm sure, longer than you've been in elected office. There is this perception when we pundits sit around and talk about it that trans issues have become this galvanizing issue for the certain part of the Republican base at the same time that it ranks relatively low in the list of the average voter's priorities. And I wonder how you're seeing that play out in a state like Montana. We've seen other kinds of anti-trans legislation in other states, I believe Utah, where it kind of it passes and people start to realize that it's going to affect one girl on one soccer team in the entire state, and at that point, everyone's like, "What are we doing here?" Do you think that this legislation in your area is actually going to bode well, if successful, for the Republicans who are pushing it? And are you hearing a lot of support for it, or at least ambivalence about it? Or what are you hearing from your constituents as you go around your state?
The legislature, the Republican-controlled legislature, is out of step with community needs. And there are trans people in every community across our state of Montana. We are your friends, we are your neighbors, we are your colleagues, and you're never far from a trans person or someone who loves us. And that's true whether you work in an office building or whether you are the governor of Montana, whose own child is non-binary and lobbied him against the bill banning gender-affirming care. I think what we're seeing is more people across the country are coming to know a trans person or be familiar with it. And much like the attacks on the gay community in the 90s, we are seeing the same strategies here, the same handful of, quote, detransitioners being flown around, much like the ex-gays in the 90s. Same harmful rhetoric. In the 90s, the argument was gay people were, quote, recruiting. And now you're hearing people say trans people are, quote, groomers. It's a similar hateful rhetoric, and it will fail for the reason the attacks in the 90s did, which is trans people are in your communities. We are your friends and your neighbors, and love will win in the end.
Do you think that detransitioners are making it up or are diluted or something in the way that I think most people consider the ex-gay movement to be? It seems to me that detransitioners I've talked to represent people who sincerely do think that the counseling, the steps they took, sometimes the procedures they got were not good fits for them. You can say that should not be a policy, having to do with anybody else. But I think they're sincere in thinking it was not the right choice in their cases.
I do think there is sincerity in a percentage. It's important to remember that about 2% of trans people detransition, and of the people who detransition, the vast majority due for two reasons. Either one, societal pressures, that they don't feel safe in their workplace, safe in their home, safe being a trans person in the political world today. Or two, they decide, okay, I think non-binary is a better line for me, and I don't want to be on hormone replacement therapy for that. What we're seeing from the detransitioners flying around is a very, very small percentage of people. And to me, I would never say that their experience was insincere. But I would also say that we don't draft medical policy based on 0.5% of a population that regrets something. We wouldn't ban all knee surgeries because the regret rate for knee surgeries is 20%. We wouldn't ban medical care that is deemed necessary and life-saving by every major medical association because a small percentage of people have regrets about it.
I mean, but this bill, I'm trying to fairly represent what a supporter of it might say here. This is not banning this care for everyone, but saying there's an age limit. I mean, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but that you can't consent to this kind of procedure, this kind of care below a certain age.
So there's a couple notes about that. The first of which is it bans a wide array of care. Again, care approved for by every major medical association. And some of this care begins with something as simple as social transitioning, allowing a child to cut their hair shorter or longer, to wear different clothes or go by a different name or pronoun. That care is disallowed in state facilities by this bill. There's also banning puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy. And it's important to note that this care is done slowly, in conjunction with the parents, therapists, and doctors in accordance with every major medical association. And it's also important to note that this care is specifically banned for trans people and not banned for cisgender people. If you have a daughter who is undergoing a shockingly early puberty and you want to get her on puberty blockers, that's something you can do. If you have a cisgender teenager who is seeking, is a high-level athlete and is seeking a breast reduction, that is something that a parent could consent to with their child and their doctor and say, this is something that my child wants, and approves it. But in an instance of it being a trans child, suddenly that's disallowed. And to me, there is no clearer discriminatory line than that.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, you said it would ban cutting one's hair in a state facility.
It would ban the use of state facilities for advocating for, quote, social transition, which includes things like cutting your hair, deciding, you're going to wear different clothes that match your gender, or use a different name or pronoun.
And what is the likelihood, in your view, at this point of this legislation passing?
So the bill was signed into law by Governor Greg Gianforte. However, it does not go into effect until October 1st of 2023, and a lawsuit has already been filed against it. I think in my read of this, the courts will find that this bill is as cruel as it is unconstitutional, and I expect it to never take effect in the state of Montana. Trans youth need this care, and I expect that they'll be allowed to have it.
Representative Zooey Zephyr, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today.